Good day and welcome to Teaching and Assessing the 21st Century Student, sponsored by Define Learning. My name is Tina Kassler, and I'm the Integrated Marketing and Strategy Storyteller at PR with Panache. And I will be serving as your moderator today. You will be hearing a presentation from Jay McTighe, and he is one of the most premier consultants in the nation. He will be speaking on this very timely subject, but before we get started, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be a closed mic session. Registrants will receive a link to the recorded version of this webinar once it's posted online. Please enter your questions for the Q&A session at the end of this webinar in the area noted Q&A. Now moving along to the webinar, please welcome Jay McTighe, who will be speaking to us on teaching and assessing the 21st century. Jay's wealth of experience, developed during a rich and varied career in education, makes him one of the most sought-out consultants in the nation. He has conducted workshops in 47 states within the United States, 7 Canadian provinces, and internationally to educators in 35 countries on 6 continents. He has co-authored 14 books, written more than 35 published articles and book chapters, and has been published in leading journals. Jay has an extensive background in professional development. In recent years, he has coordinated statewide efforts to develop instructional strategies, curriculum models, and assessment procedures for improving the quality of student thinking. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Jay.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon to everyone, or morning, depending on where you are located. I am currently in Chicago on a beautifully sunny but windy day, so welcome to all of you. I'm going to focus my comments in this webinar around the title, but more specifically, I want to explore what I would describe as the value of and the role of framing our teaching and our curriculum, as well as our assessment around authentic performance tasks. So that's what I'm planning to do during our time together. I have a pretty strong background in this topic area, including my work at the state level in Maryland during the 90s, when in our state of Maryland, we developed not only state standards, but performance-based assessments. In fact, for 9 years, the state assessments in Maryland were only performance-based. There were no multiple choice items on state tests. We learned a lot in the process. I then had the opportunity to direct something called the Maryland Assessment Consortium, which was a collaboration of Maryland school districts featuring teachers working together in subject and grade level groups to design and share formative performance tasks. In addition, I have authored 4 books around assessment with an emphasis on performance. And this includes a book with Bob Marzano, Assessing Outcomes based on Dimensions of Learning, a book with Judy Arter on design and use of rubrics, and a more recent ebook called Core Learning, Assessing What Matters Most. Some of you may also be familiar with my work with Grant Wiggins over the years on the Understanding by Design series. And if you're familiar with UBD, you know that Understanding by Design is really built around rich performance tasks, which we believe not only give evidence of understanding, but are the means to develop and deepen student understanding and ability to transfer their learning. So that's a little bit about my background. This topic is near and dear to my heart. Define Learning is the sponsor of this webinar, and I've had the opportunity to work with them most recently through creating a series of blogs on performance tasks. And you can go to their website, performancetasks.com, and access these. There are currently 7 blogs around the topic of performance tasks, and I'm going to be highlighting some of the key ideas from the blogs in this session. Also, we've just finished a series of modules, 4 professional learning modules around the design and use of performance tasks. So there's information available from Defined Learning. So I'm going to frame our time together around 3 key questions. First, just what is a performance task? Why should we use them? And what are the essential characteristics and features of such tasks? I also want to end with some thoughts about meaningful learning and how performance tasks can support meaningful learning and engage students in relevant applications of knowledge. You should have a file with the slide set that I'm using. If not, that will be available for you from Defined Learning. So you can either follow along on the screen and or on a handout set or electronic version of the slides. So what is a performance task? For me, in a nutshell, a performance task is any learning activity or assessment, for that matter, that asks students to perform with their knowledge. Performance tasks engage students in producing a tangible product or performance, and these serve as evidence of their learning. You know, earlier in my career, I thought about performance tasks as performance assessments. In fact, we would sometimes call them performance assessment tasks. But over the years, I came to realize that performance tasks are much more than something that a teacher can do at the end of teaching to get a grade or a measure. They, in fact, are why we teach. Good performance tasks are what we want students to be able to do with their learning, and therefore, rich, authentic tasks become teaching targets at the front end of teaching, not simply something we do at the end of teaching to get grades. So I've actually adjusted my language to shift from simply referring to a performance assessment task to talking about performance tasks to get at the notion that these can be and are rich learning experiences, even as we can assess student performance on the task. So why use performance tasks? I imagine that many of you are on this webinar because you already believe this. But for me, there are at least 2 fundamental reasons. The first is performance tasks enable us to focus on the most important outcomes of education. We are in an era where now learners can Google much of the world's knowledge on a smartphone. That very phenomena reminds us that just filling the heads of students with facts is insufficient, that we can access the facts. The question is, what can we do with what we've accessed? And my argument is we should be framing our teaching and our curriculum more generally and our assessments around the performances that knowledge and skills enable, not simply seeing if they have the knowledge and skills and testing those in isolation. A second purpose for using performance tasks is I believe that rich, authentic tasks honor what we know about meaningful, lasting, and engaged learning. So in our relatively short time together, I'd like to explore each of these purposes in a little more detail, starting with a look at outcomes that matter most. We can look at the outcomes of schooling through the lens of academic standards, and virtually every state in the US, province in Canada, states in Australia, and other countries have identified academic standards that describe what students should know, understand, and be able to do. One example is on the screen for English language arts. Now, one of the observations I've made in my work, both in the US and Canada and Australia, is when standards are presented, and in the US, we've had a fairly recent set of standards in Common Core and Next Generation Science and C3 Social Studies. And we've also had upgrades of state standards and provincial outcomes in Canada. One of the things that I noticed is that when teachers are introduced to a new set of standards, it's typical to go to the grade level or the core standards to see what what's there, what's new, what I need to be teaching. And I completely understand that. However, what sometimes is missed is often found in what I call the opening pages of standards documents. Because it's in the opening pages or in the front matter that we find the larger goals for which academic standards are built. So for example, the one on the screen from English Language Arts is one of those broader standards. Common Core refers to them as anchor standards. Now it's broad in scope, but it should be, because it's what we're working toward across the grades. I like to think of these as academic or performance standards in the sense that they specify what we want students to do, in this case, in writing. Here's an example in mathematics. The standards in mathematics want students to be able to apply knowledge, skills, concepts, and mathematical reasoning to address real-world problems. And some math standards have actually highlighted the habit or disposition of perseverance, with a recognition that if it's truly a problem, you don't know what to do initially. And therefore you have to really think a lot. You have to try to figure out what the problem is asking for. What numbers are needed? What algorithms apply? Is your answer reasonable? And in fact, perseverance is called for in actual and real life problem solving. Here's an example for world languages. An emphasis on the performances we want students to be able to do as they learn a new language. Any of you familiar with next generation science standards recognizes that this is an emphasis in those standards. So to put it in a nutshell, the current generation of academic standards being used around the world are placing less of an emphasis in just covering discrete knowledge and skills, and more of an emphasis on doing the subject, of performing with learning. Hence, the importance of framing curriculum and these kinds of standards or outcomes around performance tasks. In addition to outcomes in the academic arena, discipline-based, we also have outcomes that cut across subject areas, sometimes referred to as the 21st century skills. I kind of chuckle when I hear this name, because I remember teaching in the 70s and 80s and trying to do a lot of this back then. We were, in fact, trying to develop thinking skills and collaboration, the ability to work with others, and communication as well. But I do agree that while these are not brand new skills by any means, they do take on a greater importance in today's world. So cultivating these cross-disciplinary or transdisciplinary outcomes is, to me, one of the missions of schools. Some of you have seen, perhaps, surveys that are typically done with employers. On the screen is a finding of one such survey where employers in different industries and different companies, but also colleges, were asked to report on the skills that were really most critical for college and career success. And this happens to be the results from a survey done a couple of years ago. It's interesting that content knowledge is not among them. Now, clearly, one needs to know things to work in any field, but it's these cross-disciplinary skills that are recognized as equally, if not more important. These are performance-based skills. And to develop these capacities, we need kids to do these things. And I believe authentic performance tasks give them those opportunities. by showing this slide, in no way do I want to be characterized as believing the only function of school is to prepare kids for jobs. I don't believe that. I think there are many important and valued outcomes of school that transcend only career preparation. But as a parent of two 20-year-olds who watch them and many of their peers struggle to find meaningful employment, particularly after years of university, I do appreciate the importance of cultivating such skills. So I'm going to pause on this note, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to reflect on the ideas you've heard thus far. And if you are with a group viewing the seminar, or with another person even, this is a chance for you to chat, just to share your own thoughts about what you've heard. If you're by yourself, this is an opportunity just to reflect on what you've heard, but also if you have any questions that come up or things you want to comment on, you could type those into the chat box. So let us take a short pause now. And again, my big ideas here are that what academic standards are calling for and what the 21st century skills are calling for are for students to be able to perform with their knowledge and skills. So 3-minute pause for you to converse. Okay, if you can hear the bell, that's my signal, and I'll invite you back from the 3-minute pause. And I'd like to proceed by looking at this second question. So what are performance tasks? What are their essential features or characteristics? Well, I have a couple which I'd like to highlight. One characteristic of performance tasks is that they call for performance. Students are asked to apply knowledge and skills, not just remember, recall, or recognize. Here's an example of a performance task that involves application. This was developed by 2 4th-grade teachers in a state in which the state history, geography, economics are introduced. So in this case, the students are asked to apply things they've learned about their state in planning and offering their trip. Now, clearly, there's lots of knowledge to be gained in the study of a state. But to me, this task gives an example for students of how such knowledge could be used. As an assessment, it would give us insight into the students' understanding of the state's history, geography, economics, cultural aspects, and how they are interrelated. The fact that I might use a task like this as both a rich learning activity and an assessment in no way is meant to suggest that I wouldn't use other teaching techniques and other assessments. Certainly, I would have a test or quizzes on facts about the state I want kids to know. And I might have a test or a performance task around skills, such as map skills. But to me, this task puts things together in a qualitatively different and relevant way. A second characteristic, in general, performance tasks are open-ended, meaning there's not typically a single correct answer, nor is there a single way of accomplishing the task. So it's open-ended in that sense as well. Now, that doesn't mean that anything a kid does or any answer a student gives is as good as any other. There should be criteria or rubrics to guide the evaluation of performance tasks. But the idea that they are open-ended is, to me, a key feature. Once again, going back to the state tour task, you could envision in a class of 30 fourth graders, potentially 30 different tours, different sequence, different areas of emphasis. I would imagine and expect there'd be quite a bit of overlap on key sites. But again, this could and would be done differently by different kids. Just like life, most real issues and problems don't have single correct answers. A third characteristic has to do with the context. To me, the best tasks are set in an authentic, realistic, real-world situation. Once again, the example here applies that students are replicating what people really do. Tourism offices plan and conduct tours for visitors, as do travel agents. A fourth characteristic is that performance tasks give us evidence of student understanding and ability to transfer, particularly if the tasks are set in a novel or unfamiliar situation. The essence, in fact, of understanding is your ability to apply your knowledge and your skills to new situations, or say it another way, to transfer. Let me shift examples and show you another task. This is a short task developed by a high school mathematics teacher for a unit on introductory statistics, in particular, looking at the concept of measures of central tendency. Look at his very clever performance task. This, to me, is a good example of a task that gives evidence of understanding and transfer. By the way, the teacher told me that student interest in learning about mean, median, mode and understanding their differences went way up when he announced that they could tell him the method by which he should calculate their quarterly grades. But as you can see, it is a task that requires transfer in that students have different spreads of grades over the course of a quarter. And in some cases, a mean or an average would be in their advantage, but there may be cases where median or mode would be more advantageous for them. And so the students have to understand the terms or the concepts of central tendency sufficiently that they can analyze their own grade spread, decide which method would be in their best interest, and then be able to explain it, because he's after student reasoning, not just recall. So that is another example. So here is a graphic that I like to use that distinguishes the characteristics of performance tasks and authentic tasks from more traditional teaching or assessment methods. And I'm thinking now of assessments in particular. The outer oval refers to traditional assessments, widely used in classes, quizzes, tests, skill checks, or with younger children or in performance-based areas like PE, we would use observations. My visual is meant to convey the fact that in terms of kinds of assessments, these are the most widely used, and they're appropriate, they're effective for many things. In general, I would say these traditional assessments are good at assessing to see if kids know things, and they're good for assessing basic skills. But in general, they're not authentic. You know, in solving real world problems outside of school, people generally don't have 4 options of answers to choose from, like we would on a multiple choice test. But those are appropriate and effective for many things. A subset of all the tasks or all the assessments we use are performance tasks. Performance tasks yield a tangible product or performance, and they involve some application. You have to do something. Performance tasks are widely used in subjects like career technology education, visual and performing arts. They're the norm in English language arts when kids write, and other subjects as well. And then a further subset of the performance tasks that we might use are ones that are authentic. They're set in an authentic context. They reflect real-world uses of knowledge and skills. Typically, there's a target audience, real or hypothetical, like the imaginary visitors from another country to tour our state. And they are well suited to seeing if kids understand and can transfer their learning. So these for me are key characteristics of performance tasks. Let me pause once again and give you a chance to just review what was said and summarize. And if you're with another group or another person, you can converse. Also, you can take this opportunity to jot down questions or comments that you may have. So let's take a 3-minute pause, and I'm going to scroll back through some of the examples and the characteristics. Okay, I'm going to move on to explore the second part of my little scale visual on the right side. Performance tasks serve, I believe, a purpose beyond just focusing on valuable or valued outcomes of education. Their use supports meaningful and engaged learning. There's an exercise that Grant Wiggins and I have done with literally thousands of educators throughout the world, and sometimes with board members or parent groups. And I'm not going to go through the exercise in the webinar today, but I want to just describe it. Here is basically the prompt that we ask people to think about. We ask people to consider their most effective learning experience, in school or out. and then to unpack it and try to dissect what were the factors in the learning experience that made it so effective. And what's remarkable to us in doing this exercise with so many people is how common, how similar the lists of characteristics are when you ask people to describe their most effective learning and then what made it so. And one of the characteristics always, or almost always cited, is the fact that the learning experience was based upon something that was authentic, something that was meaningful, something that was relevant. And that the learning experience had a doing component. Students had to do something, often producing a tangible product or performance, and often for an audience. So let us think about how can performance tasks support learning? Well, an analogy that I'm fond of is to think about performance tasks, an authentic task, as like the game in athletics or the play in theater. The game is an authentic performance. It's open-ended in that there's not one way of playing it, and it requires transfer because every game is different, and the players have to put together everything they've learned in practice, but they have to put it together on the field or on the court or on the ice. Moreover, they have to do it on their own. Coach can't play the game for you now. You've got to do it on your own. Coach can give you advice from the sidelines, but the players have to play. So I like to think of authentic performance tasks as like the game in athletics. With the game in mind, coaches, of course, use practice. And practice is where they develop the knowledge needed by the game, like you have to know the rules or you're not going to be able to play well. Practice is where we develop the skills of the game, and many sports require lots of skill practice to get better and better. And we also have understandings, otherwise known as strategies, that are developed during practice. But every coach knows that the goal of practice is not just marching through the playbook play by play. The goal of practice is preparing for the game, authentic performance. Moreover, the players know this also. The players know that they're working with a game in mind. In fact, I've always wondered how many players, let's take football as an example, how many football players would endure harsh practices and grueling sessions in the weight room and wind sprints to improve their conditioning if they weren't preparing to get stronger and more skilled for the game. In other words, the game in athletics is why we practice. It gives purpose and meaning, and it motivates players, hopefully, to want to learn the skills and have the proper knowledge basics so that they can perform well. And I think the same thing applies. How do we prepare for authentic performance? Talk to the coaches, talk to the extracurricular sponsors for band, yearbook, debate, and talk to the career technology teachers, because these folks are the performance-based experts in schools, and they know how to prepare for authentic performance. We can learn a lot from them in the academic areas, I'd say. So let me leave you with a couple of thoughts about meaningful and engaged learning stimulated by authentic tasks. There's a construct that I found useful over the years, and it's basically a framework that can help understand and explain different factors that influence student motivation. So see if any of this resonates with you. There are two categories of factors that are in this framework. One has to do with climate factors, and this is very basic. So if you're in a learning situation, but it's too hot, it's too cold, you're hungry, the seat is too hard, you've been sitting too long, it's going to be hard to give forth maximum effort. Another factor or variable is safety, and this includes both physical and psychological safety. And we know this from a lot of experience. Kids who are in environments that they don't believe are safe, for example, kids in schools where they might get beaten up if they go into the bathroom, or they might get assaulted on the way home in a rough neighborhood, their attention is going to be less on learning academic standards and more on just physical safety and survival. Safety also functions in the psychological realm, and we see this a lot in schools. Kids who are picked on, the whole bullying phenomena is a case in point, or even less overt, where nobody wants to sit with you at lunch, or when we're choosing teams at recess, you're not picked. Kids remember these things, and if they don't feel welcomed, supported, invited, a lot of their energy, psychological energy, goes to that realm and not to learning subject matter. A related point has to do with acceptance. Students who don't believe that the teacher knows them or cares about them are probably less likely to put forth maximum effort for that teacher. And similarly, if they don't feel accepted or valued by a peer group, that concern can interfere with learning. So these are fundamental, these are pretty basic, but we know that they are impactful. But I want to highlight the second category, which is a little more relevant to today's webinar, and that has to do with task variables. So a couple of things that this framework proposes. Students are more likely to put forth effort and be interested in putting forth effort if there are clear goals and known tasks, if what they have to do or how their work will be judged is known or made public, and that takes the form of public criteria or rubrics, and also whether students have clarity because they see models of excellent performance. So these factors influence student motivation. To me, the practices of performance tasks, presenting the task as a learning goal, having kids know what's expected, know what the qualities of good products or performances are through rubrics, and then being able to see models and examples brings task clarity to both learner but also to teacher, in the same way that the game in athletics or the play in theater provide clarity to what we're working toward. A second variable that impacts motivation is one's perception of how relevant or useful this learning might be. And I've always wondered rhetorically, how many of us as adults would work hard and persist in situations where we just don't think what's being offered is worthy or relevant or can be something I can use. So when we think about those characteristics applied in schools, we're looking at relevance set up through using, for instance, essential questions around the content we're teaching, framing our teaching by and through authentic performance tasks, where kids can look at the task and say, wow, that might not be easy, but I see it as valuable. I recognize it as what people do outside of school. And a part of authenticity is, as much as possible, trying to make connections with kids' interests and experiences, not just real world uses. This is where trying to create contexts or connections that touch on personal interests or that reflect cultures are important. And finally, a variable that's important to keep in mind is a student's perception of their ability to at least be moderately successful in the task. So if students see a task that might be authentic, it might be seen as relevant, but it may be seen as so hard that they just can't possibly do it, they may be less likely to try, or they may get into dysfunctional behaviors, often seen as the fight, flight, freeze response under stress. Another aspect of teaching toward performance tasks is what I like to call responsive teaching. And this is where we give kids choice where appropriate, and we differentiate instruction to help kids that may need particular help or particular assistance. Again, if we look at coaching as a model, in my experience, the best coaches offer personalized support. They differentiate their practices. Not every person's doing the same thing all the time, and the same thing with the best teachers. By personalized, I don't mean that we have the capacity to individualize for all kids. That's not practical or feasible for most of us. But it does mean that we're going to be responsive to the kids we have and try to honor their needs, their interests, and their talents. And finally, in performance task use, I highlight the importance of celebrating not only achievement on the task, but improvement over time. This is where teachers who frame their teaching around rich performance tasks can often see growth over time in students' ability to think, to apply things, to work with others, to communicate effectively. And I believe it's valuable to always highlight, celebrate growth as well as achievement. So I'm going to wrap up our time together with a survey, or some responses, I should say, from a survey that my late departed best friend and colleague, Grant Wiggins, developed. He created a survey that was administered to more than 10,000 students at the secondary level. And the survey was mostly multiple choice or selected response in form, but there were a couple of open-ended questions on the survey. And one of my favorite questions was this one. Grant asked students to reflect on their school year, because the survey was given usually in late May. And the question was, what was the most interesting project, task, assignment that you had this past year in school in any subject? Well, Grant has compiled the responses, and they are striking in their similarity. And I put together just a few examples, but representative examples for you, and let's have a look at those. And I ask you to think about, what are the students telling us about what is most engaging for them? And one more. So in a blog that Grant wrote around the responses to these surveys, he asks us an essential question following his summary. He said, the patterns we see in student responses are straightforward, and we see them from rural, urban, suburban schools. We see them from students in international schools. The most interesting work is meaningful, hands-on, thought-provoking, authentic. And kids respond. So his question rhetorically, how often are we providing our students with these kinds of experiences, and how might we do more of this more often for more kids? So I'm going to wrap up the presentation portion of the webinar, but I will be available and look forward to questions that should be coming from you in just a moment. I would remind you, if you're interested, if you go to performancetask.com, if you go to to that website, you will see up in the upper right corner a link to blogs that I referenced and the online professional development modules that get into this topic in much more detail are there. I also recommend Define STEM, which is an extraordinarily interesting resource built around authentic tasks. And if you've never seen any of the defined STEM tasks, I recommend you check it out. You can use the website and access code to preview. So I'm going to turn it back to our hostess, I believe, who has collected or compiled any questions that may have been submitted. And if you can stick around, I will respond to those as best I can.
Yes, thank you very much, Jay. Appreciate that. And we'll be going to your questions for a brief Q&A session. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please enter your question for the session in the area noted Q&A. A quick thank you to our sponsor, Define Learning, the K-12 educational technology specialists, creating, delivering, and implementing online resources for the 21st century learner. And with that, let's go to the questions that you have submitted for Jay. So the first question comes from an individual in Idaho, and he asks, how do you balance quality assessments with time to grade?
A great and practical question. So I have a couple of thoughts, but no silver bullet answer, by the way, but a couple of thoughts. Thought number one, performance tasks clearly take more time. They take more time to develop. They take time to prepare for. They take time for students to do. If there's a presentation or a product review, they take time for that. And then from a teaching point of view, they take time to score or evaluate, typically using a rubric. You can't run these through a Scantron machine. So the question is a really important one. So one answer actually goes beyond the question, and it's a reminder that with performance tasks, the juice must be worth the squeeze. In other words, if we're going to take the time to do performance tasks, we need to make sure that they are targeting important and worthwhile outcomes. Academic standards and arguably one or more of the 21st century skills. So that's part one, my answer. Part two, however, is they're going to take more time to score or to grade. And so we have to make sure they're worth the time, number one. Number two, that we have clearly developed criteria or rubrics so that we know exactly what we're looking for, and we don't have to spend too much time trying to analyze each piece of student work. Beyond that, they do take time to score, and I don't think there's a shortcut to that. The one thing I would also point out, however, is that not everything that students do has to necessarily be graded by the teacher. Now, I do recognize that some people will push back on that statement, and they'll say, well, in my school, the kids won't do it if it's not graded. So I get that. But I've also seen enough cases where I believe that there are some alternatives. So, for example, particularly if it's a formative task or a learning activity, we can have students give each other feedback. In other words, we can have peer reviews and scoring. Now, I'm not proposing that kids give each other grades that go in a grade book and end up on a report card, but I am proposing that students can be trained to look for the qualities that are in a rubric and can, in fact, give each other feedback, which can help improve learning and performance. And often, students are more attentive to the feedback they get from peers, even sometimes more so than the teacher. Another facet of grading and evaluation is self-evaluation. I strongly recommend that kids on a regular basis be asked to self-evaluate their performances against a set of criteria and rubrics. Ideally, we want to create a culture in a classroom where kids are less likely over time to come to the teacher and say, what am I getting? What are you going to give me in the way of a grade? How am I doing? You want students to be increasingly able to answer those questions themselves. But to do that, they need to be taught how to self-assess or self-evaluate. It needs to be modeled for them. And so that's a long way of saying, well, scoring or grading a performance task does take more time. If the task is worth it, if it focuses on important outcomes, and if students put forth good efforts, then I argue that the time is worth it. Coaches don't say, I don't have time to play the game. I'm too busy covering the playbook. No, the game takes time, but it's why we practice. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jay. And here's a question that I think is a nice step forward from where you left off there. What's the best way to quantify performance assessment results for analysis over time and in larger districts?
Oh, another great question. I didn't get into it at all in this session, but a big part of designing performance tasks, again, they can be used as rich learning activities by themselves, or they can be assessments that are evaluated and scored. To me, in conjunction with any good performance task, should be one or more well-developed rubrics. The rubrics provide the guidance, if you will, for scoring and evaluation. And when we have well-developed rubrics, they provide or they yield more consistent evaluation by individual teachers and also by teams of teachers. When we get to trying to track results on performance tasks, then we need well-developed rubrics and some scale that we can use to quantify. So just a couple of think-alouds. Many rubrics that I've seen use a 4-point scale. So generally we could say excellent, good, fair, poor. Or if it were an understanding scale, it would be deep, insightful understanding, general understanding, surface level understanding, all the way down to misunderstanding. And so we would have a range. And we could do the same thing for skill proficiency. For highly proficient, able to autonomously perform the skill in new situations, all the way down to unskilled. And so we can use well-developed rubrics, and we can couple them to a point system, so it could be 4, 3, 2, 1, and we can begin to quantify student performances accordingly. And we can aggregate those results and use them to monitor over time in a school or a district. So let's take, for example, a fairly basic one, which is writing. If we're using common writing rubrics and kids are writing expository pieces, narrative pieces, and or argumentation, persuasive pieces, we can look over time at the scores of students on those various writing tasks. And we can compile the scores, we can look at the patterns, and hopefully we would see growth over time. And we can actually chart that out at the district level.
Very nice, very nice. And we have another question from someone who is asking, she asks, have you worked with any schools that are doing this, as well as cross-curricular processes? Any advice on how to approach this concept?
Another excellent question. If I'm understanding the question, I'll answer it this way: that to me, the more authentic the context for a task, whether it's a problem-based or an issue-based or a design challenge, the more authentic the task, the more likely it will be to involve more than a single subject, number one. And the more authentic the task, the more likely it will be to bring in those cross-cutting concepts or cross-cutting outcomes like critical thinking or creativity or collaboration or cooperation. It can also bring in the so-called learning to learn skills, finding and appraising information, as an example. So that's part one, my answer. Part two of my answer is another approach to bringing in the sort of cross-disciplinary skills into performance tasks is maybe you start with a performance task that's rooted in a subject area. So it may be a math task or a social studies task and so on. But often you can very easily add to a content-based or subject-based task English language arts. Because if the task involves any reading, any research, or any communication, it could be oral presentation or it could be writing, you've already built in then some cross-disciplinary outcomes with respect to English language arts. It's also possible to do something that I call grafting. If you're familiar with the concept of grafting in biology, where a biologist might graft a plant by putting a piece of one onto a stalk to grow, to graft another part of the plant, you can do the same thing with performance tasks. So you may have a task that's largely rooted in a single subject, but you might ask the question, how might we build in critical thinking into this? Or is there a place to involve students in some creative production? Or could this be done, at least in part, in groups? So we're bringing in collaboration skills. And for almost any task that I'm aware of, communication can and should be a part of the task. So we will give kids opportunity to communicate as well. So those are some thoughts about how do we both combine subject areas and or the so-called 21st century skills into performance tasks. The one last comment I'll make on this, though, is a cautionary note. While the more authentic our tasks, the more interdisciplinary they're likely to be, I think the goal is not trying to see how many subject areas or how many 21st century skills we can jam into a task, because sometimes I've seen cases where they're forced and they become kind of unmanageable or not particularly focused. The goal to me is authentic performance, and authenticity will enable natural and purposeful connections between subjects and or with 21st century skills. But we don't want to force it, is my caution.
Certainly, certainly. Thank you. Now we've got a good question here, a slightly different question than what we've been having to date. First of all, the viewer would like to thank you so much for this opportunity. But she says her district is heavily involved with Marzano Research Lab, designing competency-based frameworks. And as they look into developing rubrics, the most frequently asked question is, how do we prepare parents for this less traditional form of assessment?
Another great question. I don't have a pat answer, but I have some thoughts on this. And part of it is the need to communicate with parents. And this can be done through meetings or through newsletters or blogs, or even do a YouTube video and post it and ask parents to view it. So a couple of thoughts. The first is, I like to use essential questions. So one essential question is, what should a modern education accomplish? What are we trying to prepare your kids for? That's another way of saying it. And having parents recognize that what they experienced in school and what many teachers experienced themselves in school, we're in a different era. And many parents believe school is marching through a textbook and taking tests of facts that were in the textbook or facts that the teacher told them. But I think we're in a different era. And so asking parents, so what does the present era call for? Looking at employer survey, for example, is simply a way of educating parents that what they remember from school may not be 100% of what the goals of schooling are or can be today. A second idea then is to ask them what in their jobs, or what are the skills required in their jobs? And often when you do this, when you ask people to break down what are the most important skills in your jobs, often you get lists like the employer survey list. They recognize the ability to work with others, to communicate, to be a problem solver, to adapt to things, to learn new things on the job, to be an everyday learner, are the things that are often needed today. And so this makes the case, or can help make the case to them, that we're trying to develop these capabilities, these skills as well. There's still, I think, a fair percentage in parent community that still think that school is about learning specific facts, and assessments are to test and see if kids can remember those facts. And certainly there's a place for basic skills and basic knowledge, unquestionably. But I think by presenting to parents and explaining to parents the fact that there are outcomes that transcend just learning factual information, and that those outcomes can't be assessed completely or appropriately with a multiple choice test where there's a single answer, can help deepen their understanding of what we're after. The whole notion of competency-based education, which, by the way, is by no means new, but getting a lot, renewed interest in recent months. Think about the word. The word is competence. Competence implies your ability to perform, your ability to do something well. And that gets at the heart of what performance tasks are about and the kinds of assessments of competence or performance that is needed. So I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Jay. And with that, we have actually run out of time. I want to let you know that we'll be including a recording of this webinar as well as the slides that were shared today in a follow-up email. The 30-day trial access code there is available on the screen. And Jay, we'd like to thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. And thank you as well to Define Learning for sponsoring this webinar. Please visit Define Learning's website for more information on how they can help you and your students succeed academically. On behalf of Jay and Define Learning, I would like to thank you for joining us today.